Welcome to the deep dive. We dig into your sources so you get the insights you need fast.
Yep, making you well-informed without the overwhelm.
Today we're looking at a discussion between Maurice DeHaan and Adver Brugge on De New Wereld. It centers on an open letter DeHaan wrote.
That's right, a letter to Robert Dijkgraaf, the relatively new professor focusing on science and society.
And our listener wants the essence of DeHaan's critique, specifically about science during the pandemic in the Netherlands.
Exactly. So think of this as your shortcut to understanding some pretty significant criticisms about how science operated and communicated.
It sounds like the core issue is this gap, this perceived gap between science and society.
It is. And DeHaan's central point is that, well, he feels the scientific community hasn't really looked in the mirror about its own role in creating that gap, especially regarding the COVID response over the last few years.
A lack of self-reflection, he calls it.
Pretty much. He believes this absence of evaluation and maybe even apology for certain things has damaged public trust. We're using bits from their YouTube talk, so you'll hear DeHaan's points directly, with Brugge engaging.
Okay, let's get into it. What actually sparked this letter? What was the immediate trigger for DeHaan?
He said he was triggered, his word, by an interview Dijkgraaf gave.
Oh, okay. What about it?
Well, DeHaan felt the interview painted the picture as, society being disconnected from science, but didn't really touch on whether science itself might have contributed to that disconnect.
So a one-sided view, in his opinion.
That seems to be his take. Like, the focus was all outward on society's understanding and not inward on potential scientific missteps or, well, communication failures during the pandemic.
And his main beef is this lack of looking back, this lack of evaluation.
Exactly. His biggest worry is that conclusions and actions he sees as, well, demonstrably wrong haven't been properly evaluated or explained by the medical science community.
And he thinks that's what's fueling distrust.
He directly links it. He argues this lack of closure, this lack of owning up to certain things, is a major reason why some people are skeptical now. It's not just about making mistakes, but about not acknowledging them.
So the letter to Dijkgraaf is basically a nudge, saying, hey, in your new role, you need to deal with this history.
That's the idea. He's hoping Dijkgraaf will see that maybe this science society gap isn't just about society, but also about how science conducted itself and communicated. To acknowledge that past issues are part of the current problem.
Okay. Now, they mentioned something interesting in the conversation, that this kind of critical reflection seems less common in the Netherlands compared to other places.
Yeah, that's a key point they make. They contrast the situation in the Netherlands with, say, the U.S., the U.K., Germany, where they feel there's been more open debate and analysis of the pandemic response.
Why would that be? Did they offer any reasons for this difference?
They floated a couple of ideas. One was this concept of a regent culture in the Netherlands.
Regent culture. What's that mean in this context?
Sort of like an established way of doing things where maybe the powers that be aren't super keen on harsh self-criticism. They also suggested the media played a role.
How so?
That the media perhaps wasn't very critical during the pandemic and isn't really pushing hard for that kind of institutional reflection now either.
So the establishment protecting itself, maybe, and the media not challenging enough?
That's the vibe they give off, yeah. They suggest that any critical thinking that has happened has been more, fragmented. Private initiatives, channels like theirs, the new world, rather than a formal institutional review.
Which explains why DeHaan might feel the need to write an open letter directly to try and force the issue.
Precisely. To try and spark that wider, more official conversation that he feels hasn't happened yet.
All right, let's dig into the actual examples DeHaan uses in his letter. These are the specific points he raises to back up his concerns. First up, the initial fatality rate, the IFR.
Right. This is a big one for him. He points out that back in May 2020, Jaap van Dissel, head of the RVM, told the Dutch parliament the IFR was 5%.
5%. That sounds really high.
It was, and it was actually up from an earlier estimate of 3% in February. But DeHaan contrasts this with other evidence available even earlier.
Like what?
Like a German study by Van Streek in a border area suggesting 0.4%, and a study from Los Angeles County based on antibody tests, seroprevalence, suggesting it might be as low as 0.2%.
Wow, okay. 5% versus potentially 0.2 or 0.4%. That's a massive, massive difference.
Huge difference. And DeHaan also mentions Van Dissel later presented age-specific rates, like 1.3% for 50 to 59-year-olds, but then points to later work by someone like John Ioannidis in 2021, suggesting much lower actual rates overall.
So the core issue isn't just that the number was high, but the impact it had.
Exactly. He argues those high initial estimates created a lot of fear, and he questions why there wasn't a clearer correction or acknowledgement when lower estimates emerged. He feels that initial, possibly inflated number stuck around.
And influenced policy and public perception for a long time.
That's his argument. He even brings up a later claim where a 1% IFR was supposedly used to calculate that measures saved 150,000 lives. His point is that the foundation might have been shaky from the start, based on data that wasn't quite right without a proper reassessment.
Okay, next point. Airborne transmission. What was DeHaan's criticism there?
Well, the official line from the WHO, and also from the Dutch OMT and RIVM, was initially that the virus spread mainly through large droplets.
Right, the whole 1.5-meter distancing rule came from that, didn't it?
It did, and the advice focused heavily on things like hand washing. DeHaan argues this stance persisted even when evidence was building that airborne transmission spread through tiny aerosol particles hanging in the air was actually a major route.
So the focus might have been wrong, or at least incomplete.
That's what he suggests, that maybe too much emphasis was put on surfaces and droplets, and not enough on ventilation and the risk in poorly ventilated indoor spaces.
Did he give an example?
He mentioned an anecdote from a news report in 2021, quite late in the game, where someone well-known apparently said that not shaking hands had made the flu disappear.
Huh. Still focusing on hand contact.
Yeah, illustrating that the surface transmission idea was still quite prominent in public discussion, even when the science was pointing more towards aerosols.
Okay, let's talk about the Corona Pass, the QR code. What was DeHaan's problem with that system?
His fundamental critique is that the whole premise was flawed. The
Yeah.
idea was, show your code, proof of vaccination or a negative test, and you can enter, because that prevents spread.
Right. That was the justification.
But, DeHaan argues, it became clear vaccination didn't actually stop you from catching or transmitting the virus, especially with newer variants like Omicron.
So the pass didn't guarantee a safe environment in terms of transmission.
Exactly. He uses a really stark example. A meeting of former parliament members in November 2021. Everyone had a QR code. They were all checked. 25 out of 50 people got infected, despite the codes, despite vaccinations.
Wow. That really undermines the idea.
It does. And DeHaan's point is, there was no real official rethink of the system, even after events like that clearly showed it wasn't preventing spread.
It did feel like the story around the pass changed over time, though.
It did. DeHaan actually mentions Jaap van Dissel himself, saying publicly back in April 2021 that they hadn't even investigated the effect of vaccination on transmission.
Really? But the pass was based on that assumption.
Right. So later, the justification shifted more toward vaccination prevents severe illness, which is different from the original rationale for the pass system controlling entry to places. It raises questions about the initial basis.
Okay, another comparison he drew was between natural immunity, getting sick and recovering, and immunity from vaccination. What was his point there?
The main message from public health was generally that vaccination was better, or that being infected and vaccinated was the absolute best combination.
I remember hearing that a lot.
But DeHaan points out an apparent inconsistency in how the QR code system treated this. Initially, you only got 6 months of validity on your pass after an infection, but you got longer unlimited initially than 9 months after vaccination.
That doesn't quite align with the best combination message, does it?
It seems contradictory, and he highlights a specific study from Israel in August 2021.
What did that show?
It suggested that people who'd had COVID and recovered actually had much stronger protection against reinfection 6 months later, something like 13 times stronger compared to people who'd only been vaccinated.
13 times, that's significant.
Very. And DeHaan's critique is that this kind of evidence, suggesting natural immunity was robust and possibly more durable, wasn't really factored into the public health messaging or policy in the Netherlands.
Right. Let's move to the Omicron variant period. That led to another lockdown in the Netherlands, which felt quite different from other countries at the time.
Yes, DeHaan focuses on this. He notes that the first reports from South African doctors, late November 2021, indicated Omicron was spreading fast, but causing milder disease. Fewer hospitalizations.
Which is kind of what you expect with viral evolution sometimes, right? More spread, less severe.
Often, yes. But despite this, and despite hospital numbers actually decreasing in the Netherlands by mid-December, the IVM produced models.
Models predicting what?
Predicting a huge surge in ICU patients, up to 1,800, even in their favorable scenario, if there was no lockdown.
And based on those models?
The Netherlands went into lockdown on December 18th. uniquely in Europe at that point.
But the predicted surge didn't happen.
The actual peak ICU number was around 800, significantly lower than even the IVM's best-case prediction used to justify the lockdown.
And the lockdown stayed in
Are
place.
several weeks into January, yeah. Even when the data clearly showed the situation wasn't nearly as dire as the models had forecast.
Did Dahan mention other scientists' views at the time?
He mentioned Theo Shetters, who apparently felt around then that Omicron was basically signaling the end of the pandemic phase.
Huh.
He also told an anecdote
Go on.
about a South African doctor who first reported Omicron seemed milder and was supposedly reprimanded by European authorities because her findings didn't fit the narrative justifying strict measures.
Oof. Okay, one last specific example area. Research into overmortality or excess deaths. What were the concerns there?
De Hand was critical of the methodology used in some Dutch studies, particularly one by the University of Utrecht, carried out with nibble.
What did that study find and what was the problem?
Well, it found something quite strange. A 44% lower death rate in the first 3 weeks after people got vaccinated compared to unvaccinated people.
Lower. How would a COVID vaccine cause fewer deaths overall almost immediately?
Exactly Dehaan's question. The study concluded this showed the vaccine didn't cause excess deaths. But Dehaan argues that's a bizarre interpretation.
So what does he think explains that dip?
He suggests it's much more likely selection bias. Basically, healthier people probably got vaccinated first in the rollout. So, of course, they had a lower death rate initially anyway. It had nothing to do with the vaccine protecting them from, say, heart attacks in week 1.
Right, that makes more intuitive sense.
When he points out this study was then used by a politician to claim proof the vaccine didn't cause excess deaths. Dehaan calls the whole thing, the methodology, the interpretation, the political use, shameful.
Okay, so those are some powerful, specific examples. But the conversation also touched on broader, more systemic issues within science, right?
Yes, beyond just the COVID examples. Dehaan mentioned hearing privately from scientists who agreed with some criticisms but felt they couldn't speak out.
Afraid of consequences.
That's the suggestion. Fear of losing funding or damaging their careers. He talks about network pressure, the idea that you have to stay within certain boundaries to remain part of the scientific community's inner circles.
A chilling effect on open debate.
That's the implication. He also mentioned he actually filed a formal complaint against Nivelle and Utrecht University about that overmortality research.
He did, okay. And they also discussed an example related to scientific publishing.
Yeah, they talked about an article from the Brownstone Institute which critiqued a study published in the journal Vaccine.
What was controversial about that vaccine study?
It tried to link lower intelligence levels to vaccine hesitancy and conspiracy beliefs.
Seriously, that sounds problematic.
Exactly. The Brownstone authors argued the study done by the Israeli military had major flaws, like not accounting for mandatory vaccination policies. So they wrote a letter to the editor pointing out these flaws.
Standard scientific practice to critique published work?
Supposedly.
Oh,
But their letter apparently got bogged down. Delays, a weird review process. It was eventually rejected based on negative reviews.
okay.
But then it apparently came out that 2 of those negative reviews weren't from independent peers, but from the original authors of the flawed study itself.
Wait, the authors of the paper got to review the critique of their own paper.
That's what was alleged, which, if true, is a huge conflict of interest, completely against normal peer review ethics. It suggests a potentially corrupt process protecting a questionable study.
That does raise serious questions about the integrity of the system.
Definitely. And they also touch briefly on the money side of things.
How so?
Just the general point that many journals now rely on authors paying fees to get published article processing charges, APCs. And often, big pharma companies are paying those fees for studies they fund.
Creating potential influence.
It raises the possibility, yeah. The whole picture painted is one of interconnected networks, funding streams, and publishing pressures that might distort the scientific process sometimes, a potentially perverted system, as Dehaan put it.
So with all these criticisms laid out, where does the conversation leave us? What's the call to action or the proposed way forward?
Well, the core problem they keep coming back to is this widening gap between society and science. And Dehaan firmly places a large part of the blame on the scientific community's own behavior and lack of reflection.
So what's the solution?
He calls for things like open public sessions, conferences, where these different views can actually be debated properly, put everything on the table.
Does he think that will happen?
He sounds a bit skeptical, actually. He questions whether the key figures from the established institutions would even show up to that kind of open debate.
So is there a more concrete proposal?
The specific idea floated was to directly invite prominent scientists, university leaders, people like Graf perhaps, to publicly respond to DeHaan's letter, to actually engage with the criticisms in an open forum.
As a first step to rebuilding trust.
That seems to be the hope, to try and get the conversation started at an official level, address the distrust head-on.
This has been, wow, quite a deep dive into some very serious critiques. So if we boil it down, the main takeaway is Maurice de Haan is arguing there's been a significant failure of self-reflection in Dutch science regarding COVID.
Yes, and he's provided concrete examples from IFR figures to lockdown models to questionable research to support that, while also pointing to potentially wider systemic issues in science.
And these aren't just academic points, are they? They really hit at the heart of the science-society relationship, especially during a crisis.
Absolutely. It raises fundamental questions about trust, transparency, and accountability in the institutions we rely on for guidance. There's a sense of a potential systemic crisis, as they put it.
So here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Given everything we've discussed, what do you think needs to happen? How can science foster the transparency and self-correction needed to maintain or rebuild public trust, especially looking ahead to future challenges?
It's a crucial question. And it seems this story might not be over. They did mention planning to follow up on that invitation for an open discussion. Perhaps we'll revisit this depending on the response.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. And if you want to read more about that controversial vaccine journal study critique, we'll put a link to Maurice de Haan's website, that's more.nl, where he has a summary of the Brownstone Institute article.